Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle.
Well, hello and welcome back to the Israel Issue, where we snapshot the truth about Israel, the church, and we think about what that means for you and me as believers today. If you were with us on the first episode, we thought about the question of why does church only sort of work? And we concluded that it was not just to do with all those things that are often proposed to what we need: better buildings, more pastoral staff, more exciting worship, whatever it is. No, we went right back to the very beginnings, or almost the very beginnings of the church, 2,000 years ago, to when it became severed from the Jewish roots of the faith and lost that power which God intended not only to be in that very first generation of church, but in every subsequent generation. So today I want to think with you about the impact that happened on what 500 years ago was called the Reformation, when the Protestant church got launched into its understanding of church and of the gospel. But in effect, it only recovered one of the two keys that enabled the early church to be so successful. And we picture that at the start of the Let the Lion Roar film, in that rolling frame of the stained glass window, which pictures Peter holding the keys of the kingdom, and he's holding not one key, but two. Now, the key that the reformers did recover was the gospel, that we can be saved by grace and through faith. And at the time, it had the most enormous impact on all those who received it, because for 1,000 years before, in what's known as the Dark Ages, they were locked into the control of the church. The reason being that they did not have any access to the Bible. So the church had the power over them through the priests. They had to pay the penances for sin, and they were threatened with the fear of purgatory. Superstition was rife. So when they rediscovered that you can actually be saved by grace and through faith, this was just so liberating. And we should be so thankful to the reformers, not only for what they achieved back then, but the way that this has been passed down to you and me today. But the one that the reformers did not recover was the context of the gospel, which is that connection back to the Jewish roots of the faith and forward into God's continuing purposes for Israel. So they never really took the lid off what is now known as replacement theology, which is the view that the church has replaced Israel in God's purposes. And as a result, that many wrong assumptions were formed, and the consequence was just like for you and for me when we later discover in some situation that we actually only had half the story. So the assumption was made that in the absence of any greater context, actually the gospel could be reduced to something very personal, even privatized. It was about my relationship with God, meaning that I could get the new covenant directly from him, even though Jeremiah 31:31 makes it extremely clear that the new covenant was only ever promised directly to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And out of these wrong assumptions then came many wrong conclusions. So the conclusion was drawn that if indeed the church has completely replaced Israel, that means then the new has completely replaced the old. This means then that grace must have completely replaced law. And that began the slippery slope that the Protestant church has really been upon for the last 500 years, and it explains so much of what is going on today. But here's the rub. Because it comes to us across 500 years, that seems to give it a sort of authenticity that this really is how it ought to be. But when we think about it, we know even in our own families, let alone how in the world as a whole, bad things can be passed from one generation to another, and they become an established norm even though they are not a good thing. So the fact that the Protestant church comes to us across 500 years from the Reformation does not make it right in itself. But another reason we can think that maybe it is the real thing is simply because it's what we were born into. We all know how that experience of the circumstances you or I were actually born into physically seems so normal until we step outside them and look back in on them. And it's exactly the same for us being spiritually born again into those circumstances. So let's step out of them. Let's think about the Protestant church, not from where we are today, but from that perspective of those first believers. If you were there back then looking at today's Protestant church, what would you make of it? Would you think it's exactly what it ought to be? Or would you think that it's very far from what it should be? And I think you can guess what the conclusion would be. And the reason is that it is missing that second key, which is the reconnection back to the Jewish roots of the faith and that forward connection into God's continuing purposes for Israel. Now, imagine with me for a moment that we could recover that second key. What would it enable us to do? Would it enable us to actually open some ancient doors which have been so long locked that the King of Glory may come in? Isn't that what he wants us to experience in these significant end times? If you'd like to think more about this, then can I encourage you to go to our website, www.letthelionroar.com. Go to the Israel tab. You'll find a study which goes with this episode. And if you're watching for the first time, not on our regular mailing list, do hit that subscribe button so that you can receive it on a regular basis in the future. Look forward to being with you again very soon on the next episode of the Israel Issue.